My father once told me that in spring a young man's thoughts turn to love.
Oh, dear.
There's a divide between the Thomists on the faculty and the Calvinists. But as you know, if you study Thomas, that we are matrimonial selves. And so even the Calvinists are Thomists now, aren't they? If you live under a rock or Scotland, Dr. Jonas engaged. I'd actually like to pray for Rachel. So the ontology of boredom and the culture of I can't stop myself. For weeks we've been saying, Yonan, come on, man, you're not getting any younger. Come on, let's go. And he kept saying, it's Lent. You can't propose during Lent. You can't. You remember that whole little shtick he gave you, you know, suffering on the path to the cross or something like that? It's Lent and he's now engaged. So, boredom, a 55-minute performative example. To be a human is always to face the world with a particular stance and from a particular position. Unlike the dispassionately staring camera, we dwell in a world with a variety of moods and positions, changing not just ourselves, but our worlds as we do so. If my stance towards the world is one of eager and passionate interest, I tend to find the world sparkling and captivating. If I rather aggressively seek profit and gain, I tend to find the world and its inhabitants as resources or competitors. If I am bored, the world fails to engage. Now this is true of each and every person, and since each of us takes a particular stance at a given time, we will not always inhabit similar worlds. Yours is now captivating, mine is now an irritant, even while we may be quite near to each other in space and time, perhaps even in the presence of each other. If you get my little joke, yours is captivating and mine's irritating. Still, despite the particularity, as social and historical beings, we might expect certain tendencies to emerge whereby persons in one cultural space, even while maintaining their own personal differences, share a vision or a mood or a stance towards the world that tend not to be found with nearly the same amount of influence in other cultural spaces. In this lecture, I'm going to suggest that the stance towards the world most evident in the historical and social space of contemporary Western life is a stance of boredom. Now, some of you know my shtick on this. You've taken art and culture, so be that argument with more detail. I think that we no longer find the world beautiful or good or of worth. And since the world and the things of the world are quite worthless in themselves to us, they bore us. Of course, since we too are inhabitants of this world without worth, we find almost no worth in other persons either, or in ourselves. At the same time, we find this boredom impossible to give up. We like this stance. We like the boredom, because the meaninglessness of the world allows us to treat it and others and ourselves exactly as we wish, for we are free now. Since the world for us does not have the weight of glory, we owe it nothing, and we can do with it precisely as we wish. Or as John Paul II stated, we end, quote, by detaching human freedom from its essential and constitutive relationship to truth. Further, as he noted so often, a culture of freedom without truth, a culture where freedom is unchecked by the good of being, ends up as a culture of death. Our bored culture is a culture actively engaging in a revolt against limits, a revolt against place, a revolt against order, and consequently we are willing to harm and kill our world, each other, especially the weakest amongst us, and ourselves in a peak of freedom. So part one, sloth, disgust and impotence in the face of being. Christian tradition provides a fascinating account of a particular vice, acedia, usually translated as sloth, which seems to capture with particular aptness the spiritual conditions of our own age. No longer just a vice afflicting individuals, acedia has become a cultural reality. Nestled deep in the roots of our ways of acting and living, sloth seeps into our loves and lives in virtually every domain before finally transforming itself into boredom and nihilism, which I'll argue as the paper goes on. Acedia, the Noonday Demon, so called since it strikes often in the long hours of the afternoon, this is according to the early fathers of the church, receives a surprising amount of attention in early monastic literature. Evagrius of Ponticus, a 4th century Egyptian monk, describes the Noonday Demon as follows. He, the demon, attacks the monk and makes the sun appear sluggish and immobile, as if the day had 50 hours. Then he causes the monk continuously to look at the windows and forces him to step out of his cell and gaze at the sun, and to look around here and there. Moreover, the demon sends him, the monk, hatred against the place, hatred against life itself, and against the work of his hands. He stirs the monk also to long for different places. A wide range of effects follow: sleepiness, sickness, inattentiveness, dissatisfaction. Have you had this? Noonday demon? Afternoon? Anything would be better than what you're doing right now. You're on Wikipedia looking for new jobs kind of thing, even though there are no jobs advertised on Wikipedia. There's a feeling of tedium, restlessness, wanderlust, hatred for place, prideful and frenetic activity, floating from task to task. Evagrius even says that the monk will find new and charitable things to do for his brethren, to be very busy with charity rather than work. Instead, Sloth reveals frustration and hate. The monk actively hates, as Evagrius puts it, their place and their life. A feeling of alienation emerges, alienation from the work that God has given them, from their place, from their community. And this is often accompanied by a feeling of disgust and revulsion, and often results in a desire to escape from their life entirely. Acedia reveals a certain internal instability, which is fundamentally a destructive hatred of whatever particular good is given to the monk by God. Whatever particular good is given to the monk by God. In Acedia, the monk longs for a better place because the monk abhors what is there and fantasizes about what is not. In Sloth, we abhor what is there. We abhor what is. We abhor limits and place and order. We abhor being. Now, in my understanding, this will be my argument, our misguided addiction to freedom without truth is a revolt of the self against any thick, charged construction of the world which might demand our dwelling in the world with attendance or care or obligation or respect, and which rejects a thick narrative which tells us our identity as freely working to develop things in keeping with God's dynamic ordering to fill his beautiful kingdom. All of those things, those thick narratives, those demands, those obligations, are seen by us as insufferable demands, as oppression, as illegitimate restrictions on our unbridled freedom. And so we find ourselves hating the place that God has provided, the work that God has given to us to do, the proper ways of performing that labor. Given this disgust and hatred of the truth of being, we are stricken with acedia, which becomes for us a form of infidelity, a breaking of trust, a breaking of troth, a disgust at truth. Acedia is developed substantially by the medieval thinker Thomas Aquinas, who maintains something of Evagrius' understanding while developing it in helpful ways. Aquinas describes sloth as sadness at the divine good and an aversion to acting. So sadness at the divine good and an aversion to acting. The divine good at which sloth feels sorrow is the good of communion with God. It's sadness at the notion of being linked in loving, intimate union with God. Since union with God, according to Aquinas' theology, is our happiness and joy, sloth not only rejects joy, but finds the possibility of joy a deep sorrow. Now, humans, for Aquinas, are by nature oriented towards the pursuit of their happiness. And consequently, sloth is a rejection of our own loves. If our loves are created as they are, to take joy in the good of divine communion, and the slothful feel only sadness when presented with such joy, then sloth is sadness about our own natural loves, a revulsion and sorrow about our own love and joy and potential happiness. It is, as Aquinas says, sadness at the divine good about which charity rejoices. Aquinas says further that that sloth is an act of the will fleeing from our own internal and spiritual good. This is an absurd thing to do. Why would one feel sadness about your own happiness and your own joy? Why would anyone be in the state of loathing spiritual good as something contrary to himself? That's Aquinas' description. Isn't that a position of profound self-contradiction, to loathe your own good and your own self? In a position reflecting something of that of Evagrius, Aquinas gives a hint at what this means when he talks about the cure for acedia. He says, quote, "To repel acedia, the wise man advises in Ecclesiasticus, bow down thy shoulder and bear her, wisdom, and be not grieved with her bands." Now, just as acedia is repelled by bowing down and bearing the bands or bonds of wisdom, it is repelled by remaining yoked to the good. So acedia is welcomed, I think, by refusing. One welcomes acedia, you want it, when you refuse to give up your own lightness. That is, there is an inordinate love of freedom, and acedia is that inordinate love of freedom. A philosopher at Calvin College, Rebecca Knindig de Young, explains Aquinas' understanding of sloth in the same way. As she describes it, sloth is a resistance to friendship with God because of the burdens of commitment that such a friendship and its concomitant transformations of self would require. In the love of freedom, one is saddened at the burdens that friendship with God would cost. And so our ultimate good, God, is thought by the slothful to be contrary to our own freedom. De Young puts it this way: there is not only an investment of time, but an investment of self that is required for the relationship to exist and to flourish. Even more difficult are the accommodations of identity. From the perspective of individual freedom, to be in this relationship with God will change me and cost me. Now, this self-contradiction, this contradiction about being sad about your own good, has the further second result, Aquinas says, of crippling action, of, as he puts it, immobilizing the person. The slothful have an aversion to acting. That is, there is an aversion to work, which is precisely what we are on the earth to do. The acceptance of our task to labor is an act of will to bear the yoke, to persevere in the labor that God has given to us. Remember how for Evagrius, the monk hates the work that God has given them to do as a monk and they long for something else? For Aquinas as well, to bear the yoke is to be free of sloth. To want freedom from work is to be slothful. The work here is the work of accepting freedom with God, friendship with God. To perform good work, virtuous action in the state of sin, and thereby cooperate with God, requires a transformation of self possible only in an acceptance of God's grace and friendship. We cannot transform ourselves except by embracing friendship with God, whose love then transforms us so we can do as we ought. To reject God's friendship and the gift of God's own self to us renders such friendship impossible, and is thus a rejection of our capacity to cooperate with this transformative work of the Spirit. Sadness about the order of love cripples action, moreover, since the purpose and ability to act, to labor, is not contained in itself, but only as it cooperates or resists the Spirit's attracting us and moving us to God. Rejecting the divine good, thus, evacuates purpose, and it evacuates our ability to act as it jettisons the purpose of the act, which is friendship with God. And that leaves us only with self-love, although now it is a self-love at odds with our own good. In other words, it is a self-love which is a hatred of the good, which would be the good of ourself. A French Dominican puts it this way: acedia is a profound withdrawal into self. I said it that way because I don't know how to pronounce his name, so it's a French Dominican. Acedia is a profound withdrawal into self. Action is no longer perceived as a gift of oneself, as the response of a prior love that calls us, that enables our action and makes it possible. It is instead, love, seen as an uninhibited seeking of personal satisfaction in the fear of losing something. The desire to save one's freedom at any price reveals in reality a deeper enslavement to the self. Second part, boredom, the weightless prison. While not an exact match, I suggest that the ancient vice of acedia is now dressed in new clothes, namely boredom. Now, boredom has a history. The term itself did not exist until the 18th century and was not used regularly until the 19th. The OED records a letter from the Earl of Carlisle in 1768 about his friends who were bored by Frenchmen, which is usually what one has when one is Frenchmen as friends. This boredom was new. It was different from the dullness, lassitude, and tedium that people had no doubt been experiencing for centuries. In other words, boredom is a phenomenon of modernity and was not in some sense possible before. Now, of course, one imagines that young students found time to move very slowly at lectures in medieval cathedral schools, in much the same way that you find time to be moving slowly now. And certainly I'm not claiming that what Lars Svensson calls situative boredom is not a constant in the human experience. In situative boredom, one is bored because of something specific in a situation. Your good life teacher does and can drone on and on. One's date insists only of talking about his video game prowess. And I do talk an awful lot of grunts in my classes. I know it. Martin Heidegger describes this as something, situative boredom, as something like empty time, a wish for time to be whiled away, which we do through inessential tasks like frequent checking of emails and so on, where you're trying to kill time, get it done with. One of my great delights at the airport is to watch people incapable of just sitting in thought for 20 minutes, but who watch the clock, check the departure time, browse the magazine rack again and again, check their BlackBerry, and then the clock again, all in great consternation that only 3 minutes have elapsed. They want time to disappear. Heidegger describes this as being bored with something. And this is situative boredom. The situation is tedious, and this has always existed. People have always found a situation boring. Heidegger, however, includes a second form of boredom, one which is also likely to be a universal experience and not limited to modernity. One described as by Heidegger as boring oneself with something. So if the first form of boredom was being bored with something, the second form of boredom is boring oneself with something, which is apparently for Heidegger more profound. Boring with oneself with something is an odd phrase, and yet you've experienced this. You've had the experience, haven't you, of enjoying yourself at a party that was by all accounts a success? The food was good, jazz was playing, she was there, perhaps you were impressed by some of the guests and eager to talk to them, and even a good friend arrived unexpectedly. Still, on the drive home in that post-party reverie, you know that experience, the post-party reverie, driving home aimlessly now, kind of working through the events of the party, you conclude that you were bored the entire time, even though you're not sure why. In situative boredom, you knew what bored you. It was the wait for the plane, it was the lecture, it was the sermon, it was the topic of conversation, it was the date. All of those things bored you. Here, however, in the second form of boredom, you did not look at your watch. You did not try to escape conversation. You did not languish about with deep sighs and expressions of how dull it was. Only later do you realize that you were bored. Time was filled, and now you realize that it was empty time. You did not wish for it to be whiled away, as in the first boredom, but the party did not satisfy. It did not fulfill what it means to be a person. In fact, on the way home, you resolved strongly that you should do more with your life than go to dinner parties. I often have this experience. I had it last night at a dinner party. I often have this experience also at concerts. Yes, you were there. I didn't look at my watch the whole time. It was only later that I realized that I was being bored with something. I often have this experience at concerts. The band, the symphony, they were good and I enjoyed myself. And then I have a strange remorse or listlessness afterwards. Even a repugnance at myself for having gone. And especially for having thought it so enjoyable. Why did I like that, I ask? What was the point of it? What's wrong with me that I enjoyed that? Now, Heidegger's not done yet. The third form of boredom he identifies is being bored by boredom itself. Being bored by boredom itself. In superficial boredom, that's the first type, one is bored by the emptiness of objects, situations, and activities. But in this third, for Heidegger, most profound boredom, everything leaves one empty, including and especially your own self. Bored with everything, there is no longer any hiding place. There is no ability to lose oneself in the interesting and distracting reality, and one is, says Heidegger, compelled to listen. You know how it is, right? You've had the experience of the cables out, and you're like, oh my God, I'm going to have to talk to myself for a while. There's nowhere to hide, I'm here. So what do you have to listen to? To what? Heidegger says what you have to listen to is the indifference of it all, to the meaninglessness of everything, especially the meaninglessness of your own existence. You are nothing, really. And awareness of this, Heidegger says, is an awareness of your own freedom. It is an awareness of your, what he says, calls your own most possibility. Being nothing, I am free. Now, when I'm distracted by this or that, it is easy enough to slumber through reality in a kind of ease, in what Kundera would call the incredible lightness, because everything distracts you just enough to not have to pay attention. You know that mode of reality where everything is interesting just enough to not have to pay attention to anything, especially to yourself? Now, profound boredom in this third sort, however, forces an encounter, Heidegger says, with the task of becoming a self, and in the end, and finally, of becoming one's own self. This is what he calls essential boredom, because it grasps the meaninglessness of it all. You must make yourself into your own self, and it doesn't matter what you make yourself to be. And in that realization, you realize, he says, that existence itself isn't capable of satisfying. And existence cannot satisfy because of a failure of significance and a failure of meaning. None of it matters, he says, because none of it means anything. It is empty. A result is normlessness or anomie, with an increasing need for distraction. So you go back to distraction now that you've come to terms with the meaninglessness. A result is the need for distraction, for ways to fill the time, or perhaps, as we put it, to kill time. A feat of violence that we do best with hours of television, a device for which there is almost no use except to rid ourselves of superfluous time. Lars Svensson explains this need for distraction very well. He says, the pell-mell rush for diversions precisely indicates our fear of the emptiness that surrounds us. This rush, this demand for satisfaction, and the lack of satisfaction are inextricably intertwined. The more strongly individual life becomes the center of focus, the stronger the insistence on meaning amongst the trivialization of everyday life. Everyday life will become a prison. Everyday life is a prison, according to these folks, but it is a weightless prison, for it reveals, as Heidegger thought, the lightness, the triviality, the insignificance, the purposelessness, the lightness of our everyday existence. Things lack meaning. Events lack meaning. I lack meaning. Boredom thus reveals that for us, things are without value. Remember at the beginning I said we can take a stance towards the world? This is the stance of boredom. If I am bored, what I'm declaring is the world has no value, and neither do I. Now, the only way that things can interest us at all is enough to distract us from ourselves. Again, Svensson says, an object without quality is an object without identity. For earlier societies, things were bearers of continuity and bearers of stability. But this is in diametric opposition to our principle, which is the principle of fashion. And the principle of fashion is to make an object superfluous as soon as possible so as to be able to move on to a new one. Right, so we're consumers. This is how we're defined now. We're the acquisitive animal, and we're the acquisitive animal because we try to make things as superfluous as possible so as to move on to the new purchase. Now, when one is unbearably light, one is trapped in the prison of one's own self, but this self is nothing, it is not, and new and interesting desires are the only thing giving you a self. But you're also aware that these desires are not themselves significant. So knowing full well that the things you desire lack importance, the meaning of your desire is lost. So if the things you desire have no significance, the desire is meaningless, is it not? And still you exist as something who has to form, as someone who has to form yourself through your desires, and you know full well that the desires are meaningless. So what's the point? Part 3, nihilism, the knotting of it all. As Evagrius and Aquinas show, sloth is a vice enervating the meaning of desire. For the slothful, embedding the self in an order not of its own creation, which the self ought to incorporate and which the self ought to obey, causes horror and repugnance. In other words, for the slothful, the fact that desires and loves could be meaningful makes us sad, makes us hate. We, in fact, hate meaning. The slothful self considers freedom possible only on the condition that our own freedom is limited by nothing more than our own will. And here we discover nihilism lurking as sloth's companion. For Michael Hanby, such meaningless desire is nihilism. Long quote from him. Such culture assumes that our lives are innately and intrinsically meaningless, without the constant stream of stimulation and distraction, a stream inevitably subject to the law of diminishing returns. This nullity or nothingness on the side of the subject is matched by a similar knotting in the world. For latent in this assumption is a corollary denial of form, a denial of objective beauty, or a true order of goods that naturally and of themselves compels our interest. As a consequence, Hanby continues, according to this cultural logic, all our choices can be only indifferently related to each other. None is intrinsically good, none is intrinsically bad, and indeed no good approaches that of the good of choice itself. Hence, most citizens of the modern West, of necessity, live lives of profound fragmentation and internal contradiction, because the only good they have is choice, but what they choose is meaningless. In this two-found nihilism, both the human, so the two-found is one, both the human soul and two, the world, are bereft of the plenitude of God's goodness and beauty. In fact, the plenitude of God's goodness and beauty would be seen as oppressive and something from which to be emancipated so as to be free. Think about how we think of the limits that God has given to us, the limits of our own body, the limits of morality, the limits of, we find all of those things as good modern Westerners oppressive, and liberation and emancipation are the order of the day, so that we can choose and choose something without constraint and thus choose nothing, like the good nihilists we are. Human action is divorced from the compelling delight of God, and God's good creation is left with the free choice of an atomic and disintegrated self. Acedia thus reveals itself in the end as what Michael Hanby calls ontological boredom. For the bored lack adequate desire. They sense that there is nothing worth desiring, which is why the monk for Evagrius hated his place and his work and his life, for the goodness that was there was no longer delightful. Now in this world, things, created things, created things are pointless and are naughty. So the naughty is N-O-U-G-H-T-I-N-G. Next part, I've lost number, I think this is 4. Bleaching of things. We're going to move sideways for a moment, so we'll switch gears and come back. The bleaching of things. Grasping the created status of things, of creatures, allows us to recognize the utter value of those things. Things have value when they're created. They are not simply the necessary products of world force, neither of fate nor of chance, but of God's own free and rational decision. They're chosen by God. As chosen, they are recipients. Things receive themselves as a gift. And even their capacity to receive themselves as a gift is a gift of God. The very character and status of things reveals their giftedness precisely because of their radical contingency and received generosity. God doesn't need to create, and He does. So we find ourselves in everything in the world completely and utterly contingent. For the ancients, that was something to be terrified of. The fact that there was no necessity meant that it was irrational and something which was without intelligibility. The Christian story is a little bit different. For the Christian, the fact that I'm utterly contingent and that everything in the world need not be but results because of God's choice, it is my contingency which gives me value. Because I need not be, and God has given me to myself, and He has given being to everything else. And so everything which is a gift and thus good. If everything which was necessary, it would not have been chosen and loved by God. It just would have to be, and so it is better to be contingent. As chosen, we are gifted. Things thus receive themselves. They receive their own being as a means of grace. The philosopher Marion Montgomery, who I love so much, calls this the very graciousness of being, which is a phrase I'll admit to have cried over before. The very graciousness of being exists because things need not be, but were chosen out of love and delight. God's love, God's delight. And everything which is in being continues to be received from God. Everything has borrowed, because nothing can sustain or maintain its own existence without the ongoing, ever-giving, sustaining work of God, in whom we live and move and have our being. But note that utter dependency on God does not reduce the value of persons or things. That's what the slothful think. That's what the free think. The dependency on God does not reduce the value of things. That we are gifts does not demean us, does not make us vassals. Rather, that we are given to ourselves means that we are given our own integrity, which is absolutely counter to the modern understanding that we begin with our own autonomy. I'm not autonomous, I'm given. And since God is transcendent, there is absolutely no competition between His integrity and my own. God's glory does not require my lack of glory, and my dignity is not a threat to God. For God's own glory in part, is me, and is you, and is the cup, and is the tree, and is the forget-me-not. Now, given this participatory relationship to God, we can claim that for medieval theology, all things, including physical things, were such that there is a great and even an infinite depth present within them, because what is present within them is the very gifting of God Himself. Now, since things are maintained by the ever-present gift of God, and the gifteen, the gerund, is ongoing, God is, this is just good Thomism if you know it, God is most present to things. So present is God to things that God is the condition of their own presence to themselves. The glory of God is a present to things, and it is in things. Note, things are not God, okay? Things, however, while not God, are never just themselves, for they carry the weight of God with them in a kind of broad sacramentalism pervading all that is, and thus things are not light, and neither are you, and neither am I. Things are in fact almost unbearably heavy, for what they possess is the glory of God, who is presenting himself to that thing and establishing that thing as a being at every moment. Think Gerard Manley Hopkins. As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw a flame. As tumbled over rim and roundy wells stones ring. Like each tucked string tells, each hung bell's bow swung finds tongue to fling out broad its name. Each mortal thing does one thing and the same, deals out that being indoors each one dwells. Selves, goes itself, myself it speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, for that I came. I say more, the just man justices, keeps grace that keeps all his goings graces, acts in God's eye what in God's eye he is, Christ. For Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. Note that that is not Walt Whitman, even though it sounds like it at the beginning. Because poor Walt was in despair. Gerard Manley Hopkins knew that things selved themselves because they had Christ selving them. However, without the weight of God's glory suspending and granting being to beings, things lose weight and become thin. They become bleached out. Now, for the Christian mind, all things are ultimately returned to the Creator as gifts once they are received from God. God gives me to myself, and so I give myself back to Him, although I don't do it out of obligation, I do it out of love. A really beautiful example of this is the consecration of the elements in my own Anglican communion. God has given to humans the material and the skills to make bread and wine. God has also given them the matter from which this is made. These gifts are brought forward in procession on behalf of and from the people, where they are subsequently consecrated as gifts of God for the people of God. And then they are received again from the people who beg for their food that they've already made. So from God, back to God, and from God again. Now, in the modern disenchantment, however, things are no longer thick with depth, but are reduced to the qualities of bodies with extension and size. And so rather than allowing things to be in the almost infinite density with which they are, which is what Theoria means. Theoria means to gaze upon a thing which is. Things are reduced to those categories of the objective method. In other words, things for us good moderns must meet the test of the subject. As Kant puts it, no longer will the mind correspond to the real, but the real will correspond to the mind, which is why he also then says that science will put nature to the rack. Bacon talks of nature as a woman, and we do to her as we wish, which is the principle of modern science. Humans, with their objectives and objectivity, will define what is real, not rather than giving way to the real with reverence and wonder. So objects, things for us are now objects, and they are objects out there, standing over and against the mind, distanced and alienated from us and from our mind. And that distance is a problem to overcome. Think Descartes. Objects are problems for us. Think about when Descartes can't convince himself whether other people are real or not just robots with strings and pulleys out there. Imagine being Descartes. Jonas finally overcome his Cartesianism. You were getting bored, so I had to do this. It wasn't funny, but I still had to do it or you would have drifted. For us, objects are problems and we solve it with a method. But the method for us is not the organon, as Aristotle put it, where the organon is the tool for hunting, but it's the tool for hunting the real, so as to, in theory, gaze upon the real and in reverence know it for what it is. In fact, there's actually a fairly startling reversal in the history of language of the meaning of the terms of object and subject. For medieval intentionality theory, a thing known, a tree or a cat or a person or a bee, was a subject of being, whereas for the modern mind, that thing which is known is an object. For the medieval, that was the subject. One knew it, and it was the suppositum of its own being. It was the subject which we knew. For us moderns, it is the object, and we master it. As a subject, things have a thick interiority. They have a form, or a nature, or an essence. And there is an instance or relationship of justice when we know the thing. Now, that medieval understanding is for us inverted. Things are objects. Things are also now objects under the governance of a method, and that method is determined by us, the knowing subject. And so we are no longer bound by and to the thing. Now, if we're not bound by the thing, but rather they are bound by us, what limits or orders our relationship to the things other than our own will? In what way can our desires be ordered so as to respect the integrity, the almost infinite density of the things? In fact, for us, we think of integrity as to have our objectives fulfilled, ourselves put into a position of coherence as defined by our will. Think about how we think of the term authenticity. Authenticity, as Heidegger puts it, is being your own self. It is not living in accordance with the integrity of being, is it? And so for us, in order to have our authenticity fulfilled, our wishes cannot be thwarted. And so for us, objectives and objectivity are a kind of power, and a power rooted in our own freedom, which is unconstrained by anything other than our own will, which is what political liberalism is. Disengaged freedom is the modern outlook in which humans no longer see themselves defined and ensconced in a larger cosmic order. Remember the claim I made earlier that pre-moderns could have boredom in the first and second sense, but they couldn't have boredom in the third sense? They couldn't have boredom in the third sense because the universe was drenched with being. If you exist in the cosmic chain of being, meaninglessness in the third sense is impossible unless you're afflicted by sloth. But sloth was something that was undone by obedience to the rule. Is that how you think of your vice as being undone, as obedience to the rule? Instead, for us, living in accordance with order is not freedom. Conforming one's life to the natural is not freedom. We consider ourselves to be radically autonomous agents. In other words, we consider ourselves to be self-legislating. For us, order is created by the agency of the individual. And so this is what we call disengaged freedom. It's a radical autonomy. It's freedom from the now absent divine source. If the self does exist in a chain of being, then reason has a natural trajectory. In much of the pre-modern tradition, reason was understood to reach its purpose in contemplation or in leisure. But if there is no natural trajectory to reason, and if autonomy becomes an elevation of the will, then reason's purpose is to serve the will. Think Hume. Reason's purpose is to serve the will, and merely calculates the best means to the desired end, whatever that desire happens to be. And so reason for us becomes merely calculative and instrumental. It becomes, like so many good modern university teachers, a form of techne. Our task is no longer, as good moderns, to contemplate, but to harness or manipulate or control or to challenge the world to our desired ends, and we're really good at it. In fact, our new status as autonomous means that we have dominion over nature, but in a radically disengaged way. All of those old limits of nature, finitude, custom, our own bodies, these are thought to be arbitrary, without value, mere facts that might be altered to serve our purposes. Consequently, the modern person exists in a fundamentally agonistic relationship, a war. An agonistic relationship to their own selves, to others, and to the world. For everything is now open to manipulation by a technique. Our bodies, the bodies of others, and the physical universe exist without purposes in themselves, but can be dominated as we wish. For us now, the world exists in a condition that Martin Heidegger calls standing reserve, as an undifferentiated set of resources waiting for us to use them. And until we use them, they are for us nothing. Now, part of this involves the movement of the being of things from weight to lightness, from density to bleaching out, and I argue this occurs in the loss of the giftedness of things. Rather than having their being as creatures, they are objects of facticity. They're just there, standing, waiting for us to use them. Now, of all the figures that I've read, John Paul II best understands the relationship between this irrational account of freedom, which occurs when one rejects the faith, and the violence which lurks behind that freedom. And he taught repeatedly that there would be certain crimes against life that would be justified and in fact demanded in the name of rights and of individual freedom. That's all quotes from him. This system of rights-enshrined crime, I love that phrase, it's my own, rights-enshrined crime. This is what he says, destroys itself and becomes a factor leading to the destruction of others when it no longer recognizes and respects its essential link to the truth. When freedom, out of a desire to emancipate itself from all, this is still the Pope, from all forms of tradition and authority, then the person ends up by no longer taking as the sole and indisputable point of reference for his own choices the truth about good and evil, but only his subjective and changeable opinion, or indeed his own selfish interest and whim. When such misunderstood autonomy governs our life, it is inevitable that others must be rejected. For, again, the Pope, everyone else is considered an enemy from whom one has to defend oneself, since every other person is a competitor to our own unchecked sovereignty. And so in this relationship, the common good is not sought, only the individual good. And when goods conflict, there is a breakdown of genuinely human coexistence. Now, this is especially acute, and I'm almost done. This is especially acute given the new power of technology. Not only have we freed ourselves from the bonds and bounds of nature, which is for us the same thing, of course, but we have alienated ourselves from them, declaring them enemy, and have found ways of exercising our superiority with our techne. This is incidentally not a screed against technology, but rather a sobriety about our comportment as over our power. Of course, for us, nature includes not only the physical world, although that too, but also other persons, ourselves, our own body, everything. For now, everything is bleached out and without resistance to our will. Now, if we circle back to Sloth, it seems relevant here. For Evagrius, there was for the slothful a hatred of place and even of life itself, a hatred of place and its limits. For Aquinas, there was a sinking back into the self which refuses the grace and transformation, the obedience, necessary to enter into real relation. In both instances of sloth, as Evagrius and Aquinas describes it, the slothful self, or as I'm claiming the slothful culture, hates the truth of being and wishes instead to be free of the claims of truth. And so boredom and freedom have a symbiotic relationship thus, for boredom frees us from the claims of being. Remember Heidegger's claim that in profound boredom we were released by meaninglessness into our own possibility? Released by meaninglessness into our own possibility, into our own freedom. That things don't mean that we don't live in a world drenched by God's grace is for us releasement or emancipation into our freedom. And so we can be free. At the same time, this freedom is increasingly groundless and meaningless, increasingly a fiction and increasingly known to be a fiction of will, and it signifies nothing. It's like reading the last stuff in Derrida, where Derrida longs for the Messiah to come and then prays that the Messiah does not come, because if the Messiah comes, the Messiah will end our own freedom, and so we must actively pray for the Messiah who never comes. By the way, he's taking that from Kant. It's an essay from Perpetual Peace. Nothing new under the sun. So, it's a fiction, and we know it to be a fiction, this freedom. It signifies nothing. And so, my claim is this, that to be free now, for us good moderns, requires that we hate being. Boredom is a hatred of being, and so boredom is the condition of our new freedom. And this is the culture of death. Again, John Paul II. He says, it is a question of the moral conscience of society, not only because it tolerates or fosters behavior contrary to life, but also because it encourages the culture of death, creating and consolidating actual structures of sin which go against life. The moral conscience, both individual and social, is today subjected to an extremely serious and mortal danger. I keep using the same statistic in all of my courses. I think everyone is now immune to it, but I find it still shocking. 41% of pregnancies in New York City ended in abortion last year. 41%. We're free. It's good. We love it. Okay. I don't want to go on forever. Neither do you. Perhaps you'll agree with me. Perhaps you won't. And I suspect some of you, less inclined to life in the clouds, like Aristophanes, will want to know what we should do about it all, thus exhibiting your own entrapment to techne. But in any event, philosophy occurs mostly in conversation. So, let's fight. We have 15 minutes for just free-for-all, and then I guess we have constrained free-for-all for 15 minutes after that. So, what would you like to know?
So, do you think you could state succinctly what you perceive to be the relationship between acedia or boredom and the will?
So it's a type of will where one desires only to be one's own self and to have one's own freedom, even though that will is meaningless because it's a rejection of the point of one's will, which is to know and enjoy God forever in intimate friendship.
So it's more of a twisting of the will than a deficiency.
It's what Kierkegaard calls the demonic, right? Where you sink into yourself until you're in the prison of your own creation. And one rejects the agent of freedom because that agent of freedom would ask you to be free.
This is all a little dramatic, isn't it? The abortion statistic is quite staggering, but is anything else that, are we really killing everything? Culture of death sounds like we kill everything.
Yeah, I actually don't find it all that dramatic in the sense of being overwrought. I think abortion is a pretty good example of that. I think the increasing rejection of the limits of our own body in the sense of the limits of sexual morality is a pretty good example of that. I think the delight of the transhumanist movement's a pretty good example of that. I think the new paganism, this may offend some of you, but I think the new paganism of the increased new primitivism and new paganism of body modification is an example of that, the hatred of the body that God has given to us. That movement in its origins started as a form of S&M in a sexual subculture, which has become mainstream. It's odd.
So along those lines, what's the for this bored in this culture of boredom? What is the relationship then between the body, the human body, and the self? What is the self, and then what is the relationship between the self and the body?
There's a philosopher at NYU named Hans Jonas who wrote on Gnosticism, ancient and modern. He's got this beautiful essay on Gnosticism and existentialism where he goes after Kierkegaard, Sartre, and others. Heidegger and Sartre and others. And one of the arguments that he makes is we could anticipate in modern culture that we would find something like that dual movement that you find in ancient Gnosticism. So in ancient Gnosticism, there's a sense that we are alienated even from our own bodies. And that tends to result in one of two moves. Either an absolute libertinism about the body, so the Gnostics, because the body didn't matter, you could do whatever you want, eat whatever you want, sleep with whoever you want, just be free with the body because it was all going to burn away and didn't matter. So I think the one sense would be the body is alien from the self, and so one can treat it as an instrument, and so it doesn't much matter what you do with it. The other sense was a kind of asceticism of the body, which is a kind of hatred of it. Right? So Walker Percy in his novels gives a similar sort of evaluation where he says modern society will tend to alternate either between angelism, where we think that we're not bodies and the body doesn't matter and we can do with it whatever we want, or bestialism, where we think we're only bodies and we reduce ourselves to the level of a body, and that becomes our all-consuming passion. Whereas the Christian answer is, of course, right in the middle of some form of ensouled body or hylomorphic union or something. For us, either the body's all we are and it's all that matters, or we're indifferent to it because it's a tool for our own emancipation and pleasure.
Either an animal tool or an
Either an animal or a spiritual tool. Lots of good Christians are guilty of that.
Then what do you make of in the social sciences the vocabulary, say, of race and gender, and versus as opposed to sex and ethnicity, and these ideas, that the notion of constructions of the body, social constructions of the body, does that fit into this in some way?
This is revenge for the earlier jokes.
It is indeed.
This is Jonas saying, how can I get Snell fired?
No, seriously. I mean, the body and social constructions of the body. These are two different ideas.
That's right. So I am primarily sexed, which is a category increasingly ignored.
Elaborate, please.
The limits of my body are such that I am either male or female, with the corresponding biological and chemical realities that go along with that. There can be disorder of that, and there can be disorder of its desires, but those are the options that God has created. And we're at war with that pretty actively.
I just wanted to go back to something that you had quoted but it was something about nature is a woman, and we can do with her what we wish.
That's what Bacon says,
Bacon
not my
says,
position.
Yes. Something that you quoted.
His middle name is Bacon, by the way.
It's in,
That's not true.
it's in the new. It's in the new Organon.
Anyway,
It's in the new Organon.
okay.
Yeah, Machiavelli says it about fortune, Kant says it about science. There's this whole metaphor in early modern thought of the male doing to the woman of nature as he wishes.
So I guess what my question is like, with the idea of boredom, what do we do with modern science? You know what I mean? Like, is it how do you go forward with that?
We take benefits where they are, we judge carefully, and we don't think that all suffering should be ended and all pleasure and ease attained. We happily embrace certain forms of small martyrdom for ourselves. Not all. We believe in reason, we believe in good order, we believe in the dignity of thought and the dignity of body and the dignity of science, because all truth comes from God, and we are deeply suspicious when that attempts to reorder or disorder what God has given, and we do not imbibe. And so good judgment there needs to be done. That's not an absolute totalizing claim. That's some of it's great, some of it's not, some you enjoy, some you don't, some you're cautious about and enjoy, others you wait about to see where it goes, others you refuse to engage in as intrinsic evils, which if one engaged in, one would be in danger of grave and serious sin. But that's no different than any other time. It's just those temptations are particularly acute for us, given the power that we have, and some of that power comes from the rejection of limits. But you embrace limits is a good thing from God.
So it sounds like then Heidegger's three stages of boredom. It sounds like that's a progression towards eventually it's just boredom. It's you, everything's done. And at the same time, for pre-moderns had the first two, but people, I guess culture, society writ large, had to sort of evolve together in order to get to that final stage. And now that we have technology, now that we have a conception of science, it's taken over common sense, so it sort of manifests itself in a different way. Would you say that the next step, that there's one more stage in boredom that Heidegger hasn't even articulated yet, sort of we had to kind of see it exemplified first? Or is it maybe, no, the next step out is it's death of a culture, or there's a lot more space, there's more maturing stages before we reach that point?
I can't prognosticate about that. Heidegger, near the end, says that the history of being and the history of reflection in the West has moved to a position where we're fundamentally at odds with being, right? Where we're at war with it. And he has that famous line where he says, "Only a God can save us now, and there is no God." And you killed him. Zarathustra comes into the city and he says to all the burghers gathered, "There is no God, there was a God, he's dead, you killed him," and the burghers blink and go about their business. So, who knows where that goes? God's good, there's grace. God's good.
Regarding medicine, what limits should we not embrace?
So the Ecclesia Project is this group that I belong to, which is, you'll be surprised to hear this, loosely associated around Stanley Hauerwas. I'm shocked that I was in that. He's become an Episcopalian now, so it's okay. The Ecclesia Project has this really lovely little pamphlet by a medical doctor about the limits of medicine, Christian reflections on medicine. We of course believe in the goodness of the body. We of course believe in the redemption of the body. We of course believe in the resurrection of the body. We believe in the incarnation. The body's good. It's good, it's good, it's good. God loves it, it's very good. He became it, he'll resurrect it again. We value those contributions which allow for recovery and healing and dignity and joy and peace and life and prosperity and so on. Suffering and death is not the greatest evil. So that's the principle. The judgments, of course, need to be worked out in painstaking detail, and that will take decades of thought. As the science and the medicine keep changing, we'll constantly have to reevaluate the application. But the principle of it is the body's good and ought to be protected, ought to be treated with dignity, and suffering and death are not the worst evils.
It'd be easy to understand your talk as completely demonizing modernity. And I guess my question is, things like modernity has introduced this third stage of boredom, which is impossible before it, which leads to like a culture of boredom or
Oh, it's
death.
debatable, of course.
Sure. But if we accept that, what does that do to the entire narrative of philosophy? Does that make modernity a break from that narrative, or is modernity still part of the story that we move through?
Well, that's the question I asked you in class the other day.
Well, I mean,
I didn't know the answer then either.
I knew it.
So one has to decide what your story about Western development is. Is it a development, or is the Via Moderna a break? Okay. So there's a form of conversation about this which I haven't even in some sense made up my own mind about, but I like the language. So you can think of those kinds of Christians who think that what Christianity is doing is appropriating sources which allow for the advent of modernity, allow for things like liberal democracy, allow for things like liberal and progressive economics, and so on. I'd call that Whig, well, the person I'm thinking about calls that Whig Thomism, okay? It's Thomism because it's borrowing upon McIntyre that your options are Enlightenment, postmodernism, or kind of Thomism. So it's Whig Thomism. Thomism results in modernity, and so modernity is the full flourishing of Christianity. Okay, option number one. The other option, the person I'm thinking about, her name is Tracy Rowland. She writes this really lovely little book. She calls postmodern critical Augustinianism. Of course, that sounds better if you say it that way. Postmodern critical Augustinianism. Augustinianism because there's a break between the Augustinian tradition and the non-Augustinian tradition. The Augustinian tradition assumes things like love is first, and when loves are properly ordered, so too will reason be properly ordered, so too will our lives be properly ordered, and so on. The Whig Thomist thinks the change of loves from the ancient through the Christian to the modern is a development perfectly in keeping with Christian principles. This postmodern critical Augustinian says, no, there's a radical break. David Schindler, a theologian at John Paul II Institute at Catholic University, he's part of that school. McIntyre would be part of that school. Whig Thomists would include folks like Richard John Newhouse, the First Things crowd, Michael Novak, Bernard Lonergan, those kind of folks would be Whig Thomists. There's a story there. You have to figure out the judgment. There's arguments for both sides. Whatever is the case, though, whatever the advantages of modernity, it's now fraught with problems that did not necessarily previously exist. A great little book on that, which you could read in 15 minutes and get kind of what's fraught there, is Charles Taylor, the great historian of ideas book, Ethics of Authenticity. Short little book where he talks in the beginning about the three malaises of modernity. They're all malaises and problems and difficulties with which we might lose our soul because of the advantages of modernity. He would be part of the Whig school. He thinks these are genuine advantages and really difficult and problematic ones.
Obviously, the culture of boredom is invaded in church. Things like loud music, flashing lights, and stuff during our worship, and things like that. At what point can we see that, like,
He said that, not me. I made no claims about that.
At what point do you see that, like, that progression? Like, at what point has it gone too far? What are we losing in that? And then, if you can speculate, where do you see that leading?
So, you have a church where you have faithful proclamation of the word and faithful administration of the sacraments. Anything else is not church. Is that fair? Yeah, we have entertainment church, right? There's a mega church in Indiana where it's sponsored by a coffee company, and the pastor gets up, big screens and all that, of course. The pastor gets up with his cup and puts it on the dais so that the cameras can get on it so that it's projected on the screen. Churches are now built like shopping malls, are they not? So that people feel comfortable in the space of them. They have food courts. Those food courts are often imitative of food courts that you'd find in the mall, right? This will really offend you. That sort of Christian t-shirt companies kind of stuff, like this blood's for you, right? And add Jesus and all that kind of stuff. You find that in church culture where the best it can do is not make culture in keeping with faithful proclamation of the word and administration of the sacrament. But the only thing it can do is take entertainment culture and try to make it vaguely clean. Which is fairly sad given the enormous cultural heritage and patrimony of the faith, which built the universities and the cathedrals. It's just kind of pathetic to sell your birthright for a mess of pottage.
Just briefly, you mentioned our identity as consumers, and I was just wondering how that works or doesn't when the things that we consume, that we add on to ourselves, are themselves weightless.
Yeah. So I've told some of you this story before, but I've probably told all of you this story before. You already know what it is. Walker Percy in Lost in the Cosmos has this brilliant description of fashion, which I think is just so hilarious, where he talks about fashion as a kind of vampiric culture. Right, so I love this story as he tells it. He says, so here you are, you're a bored, modern, weightless person, and you know everything's bored and weightless. And you open up the magazine, and you see the model, right, sort of impossibly airbrushed, wearing some item of fashion. And your first response is, look how silly that looks. Right, look how preposterous. I shouldn't admit this, but I really like reading Vanity Fair magazine. I happen to think it's the best magazine in America. And one of the reasons I like reading Vanity Fair is for the jewelry ads. And one of the things that's really interesting lately is what I call the dead woman phenomenon of advertising. All the women are dead. Many of the women look as if they've been abused and left for dead. And then David Yurman jewelry. Very odd, very strange, the sort of implicit violence and objectification is so overwhelming that you don't know what to do. Percy says, you look at that and you think, how preposterous, how bizarre, how silly, I would never do that. I would be preposterous to buy that and wear that. Okay? Then a few weeks later, usually the way it trickles down in middle-class societies, about 8 months later, you see one of your friends wearing it and you think, she looks so silly and fat. Right? But then your other friend is wearing it and you think, she also looks preposterous, but did they get together and talk about this? And why don't I know? Right? You feel the desire beginning to build, right? Beginning to build because you don't know, and so your desires must now be wrong and out of fashion. A third friend, a fourth friend, a fifth friend, and pretty soon you find yourself in the dressing room trying it on, sort of surreptitiously, hoping no one knows you're there, because you're too cool to go to the mall. The attendant says, that looks good on you. That's you. And Percy says at that moment, you actually think, this is me. Right? So you know that experience you have of buying what you previously thought was absurd, but it's now in fashion, and so you have it too, and putting it on and feeling utterly conspicuous, like everyone will look at me and laugh at me if I wear this, right? Because I'm clearly not capable of wearing this. My mother-in-law keeps buying me fashionable things, and I put them on. She always says at Christmas, right, fashion show, RJ, and I'm like, really? I'm gonna die. But I put it on, and I feel like I'm utterly naked except for these Uggs. So they go back. But you know that experience where you have it, you feel utterly conspicuous, and you wear it to school the first time feeling utterly conspicuous, but now in a good sense, they will see me. They will know I'm part of the club, right? She and she no longer look silly and fat. They look as good as I do, right? 8 months later, a year and a half later, that item of clothing, that item of fashion, that bit of technology, right, that download, whatever it is, figuratively or literally, is in the back of the closet buried under another accumulated load of crap. Right? You have, Percy says, like a vampire, sucked your identity from it, drained it of existence and being, because it never had any anyway, except for the mutual projection of desires that you and I in fashion projected upon it. We both consumed it, gave ourselves a consumed, ready-made identity. As long as we mutually reinforced our identities with our desires, it disappeared, we throw it away. And you see it in the back of the closet, and you look at it and you say, I can't believe I had that. That's not me. Right? Whereas before it was you, now it's not you. Or even worse, you see a picture of yourself from a year and a half ago wearing that shirt or whatever, and you think, oh, good God. Who is that person? I think it's a pretty good example of consuming when things lack meaning, as do desires. We mutually create the desire and consume the being of the thing until we no longer are given being from the consumption, and we discard it. Which is exactly why you're buying your new iPad too. Yep, we're done. Thanks very much. Enjoy your weekend.